Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
North Korea's nuclear ambitions are now clear.
We now know that that regime was deceiving the world and developing those weapons all along.
Day after day, the North Koreans turn up the heat another notch.
North Korea says that it needs nuclear bombs to defend itself against an American attack. President Bush has drawn the line.
Today, the North Korean regime is using its nuclear program to incite fear and seek concessions. America and the world will not be blackmailed.
This administration has dug its heels in and said anything that we do vis-a-vis North Korea is appeasement. Once you define it that way, it's very hard to unpaint yourself.
It was pretty clear that we were being blackmailed. I don't believe that we ought to pay the North Koreans to get them to sit down.
While the United States debates how and when to talk to North Korea, Frontline investigates Kim Jong-il's brinksmanship.
We have months, not years, to resolve this problem before it reaches a point of no return.
Tonight on Frontline, Kim's nuclear gamble. The Cold War ended 14 years ago, but it seems no one told the North Koreans. The capital, Pyongyang, remains their version of a utopian socialist showcase. Its murals and monuments celebrate the victory of the working class. Its wide streets and apartment towers, the products of central planning. Underground, party workers ride to work on gleaming subway trains. But Pyongyang is an illusion. Most of North Korea is impoverished, if not famished. Foreign aid workers estimate that as many as 2 million people might have died of starvation between 1994 and 1998. Others, especially children, are malnourished. North Korea is anything but a socialist paradise.
There's no question that it's a very strange place. It is heartbreaking what the situation of children and old people is. And therefore, one has to realize that you're dealing with about the most dangerous situation you can imagine, of isolated, repressive government and a people that has suffered in unimaginable ways. History, human nature would tell you they can't go on like this forever. And while that's true, the North Koreans see themselves as a miniature Soviet Union, arrayed against a hostile world. The paramount objective of the North Korean regime is survival of itself.
The man who built North Korea is the late Kim Il-sung. In spite of the country's hard times, he is still revered here as a kind of deity, a great leader who has miraculously defended his tiny nation against much larger, more powerful enemies. With Russian backing, he fought off Japanese occupation in the 40s. After partition of Korea following World War II, he led a war of aggression against South Korea and the United States in the 50s, the Korean War. After 1 million dead, including 35,000 Americans, a ceasefire was called, but no surrender. The country remained divided and officially still at war. Kim stayed in power in communist North Korea. He built a society that worshipped him as the nation's sole savior.
It's almost superhuman what this man was. He was a god king. And it's the cult of personality that was built around Chairman Mao in China, in spades. It has the elements of Nuremberg in 1936, with goose-stepping troops going down there. It's a powerful image that you get. You take the cult of personality, you take Nuremberg, and then you add, as many say, the touch of 1984, George Orwell.
Since the Korean War, the United States has often come into conflict with this small, belligerent nation. But understanding North Korea's intentions has always been difficult.
I refer to North Korea as the longest-running intelligence failure in the history of U.S. espionage.
Donald Gregg spent 14 years in Northeast Asia trying to recruit undercover operatives to work inside North Korea.
They were very difficult to recruit. I think the reason being that they came from a country that had a tradition of being the hermit kingdom, trying to shut out the incursions of foreigners. They came from a Confucian tradition, very tight family structure, and then there was the overlay of self-reliance and the overlay of the particularly virulent kind of Marxism which had been adopted in the North. And they were just extremely difficult to get at. And then there was a very difficult problem is if you did get one to agree to help, it was almost impossible to do anything with him once he returned to North Korea.
As a result, the U.S. has relied almost entirely on satellite photos. The current conflict with North Korea began in 1989, when one photo showed new construction at a nuclear complex near the town of Yongbyon. Some American intelligence analysts suspected the North Koreans were in the early stages of building an atomic bomb. At the time, the Cold War was ending, and North Korea was losing the security guarantees and economic support from the Soviet Union that had sustained it for 45 years. Kim Il-sung was considering his alternatives.
What did the North Koreans want?
We didn't know at the time. We thought they wanted nuclear weapons. And as we got into negotiations with them, we came to understand that they were willing to consider other routes to improving their own security, and that the route that seemed to attract them the most was a new relationship with the United States.
Well, the opening probably came in January 1992. And this is when Kim Jong-sun, probably 5th to 7th in the hierarchy in North Korea, comes to New York City. And we had a whole day with him. And the idea was that this was the highest level meeting we'd had with the North Koreans, really, since the armistice.
Since 53.
Since 53. And they seemed to be anxious to open up with us.
It was encouraging that during those first meetings, the North Koreans agreed to allow a team from the International Atomic Energy Agency to visit the suspect nuclear facility at Yongbyon. The delegation was led by then IAEA Chief Hans Blix.
We are here to familiarize ourselves with the nuclear program of your country.
Blix's tour was prelude. What he and the United States suspected was that the North Koreans were secretly using this 5-megawatt reactor and a reprocessing facility to turn spent fuel into weapons-grade plutonium. Before leaving, Blix arranged for fully equipped inspection teams to follow. But over the next several months, inspections did not go well. The Koreans repeatedly blocked inspectors from visiting 2 of Yongbyon's suspected nuclear waste sites. The North Koreans understood that their ability to improve relations with the outside world was at stake. But apparently, the price was too high. Just 7 weeks after President Clinton took office, Kim Il-sung reversed course. North Korea announced it was going to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. Clinton appointed Robert Gallucci to quickly start a new round of negotiations.
More than once in that first meeting, Vice Foreign Minister Kang said, "You wish to strangle us." I told him that we did not have the objective of strangling North Korea. I told him that we actually did not pose a threat to North Korea, unless, of course, North Korea did something to threaten our allies in South Korea or in Japan or the international community.
The administration was under heavy domestic pressure. Republican opponents repeatedly attacked the Clinton administration for even trying to negotiate, arguing that the government had no business talking to the North Koreans.
We have made clear to the DPRK that certain steps must be avoided if our discussions are to continue.
The real crisis period was May and June of '94, when we seemed to be headed more on a road to war than we did on a road to a negotiated end to the conflict. That was a very tense time.
And you walked out on the negotiations at one point.
We did. We had warned the North Koreans not to do something, and they quite deliberately did it.
On April 19th, 1994, North Korea raised the nuclear stakes by announcing it was going to move its stock of irradiated fuel from its 5-megawatt reactor without providing international inspectors the ability to monitor the process. The North Koreans were also threatening to go one step further.
They were ready to reprocess the fuel from that reactor. It announced they were going to reprocess the fuel from that reactor. And had they done that, that would have given them enough plutonium to make about 5 or 6 nuclear bombs.
What was it that prompted them to take those actions?
My judgment then and my judgment today was that they determined that they needed nuclear weapons for their own security. So we decided that we would take every action to try to stop them going ahead with that nuclear weapon program, even if it would risk war.
You were willing to go to war?
We were willing to risk war. We seriously considered solving the problem directly by simply striking the reactor and the processor at Yongbyon.
We analyzed each building at Yongbyon, particularly the reactor, also the fuel fabrication plant, the reprocessing plant, the reactors under construction, and we were absolutely confident that we could have carried out a strike which would have been surgical within its own frame.
So why not do it?
Well, the larger consequences would be far from surgical. North Korea maintains 1 million men on the DMZ, thousands of artillery tubes that are trained on Seoul, and Scud missiles that are trained on South Korea. The intensity of violence would be greater than any the world has witnessed since the last Korean War, and that would shock people.
The estimates are up to 100,000 American casualties.
And plus civilian deaths?
Presumably. It's a terrible scenario to try to think through, but hundreds of thousands of deaths, yes.
Seoul, the capital of South Korea, is a city of 10 million, only a 1-hour tank drive from the North Korean border. The Clinton administration opted for UN sanctions. However, Ambassador Gallucci and Secretary Perry realized this move would also be extremely provocative.
Even just a sanctions resolution, we all thought, might well lead the North Koreans to a military response.
It was in that context, and that during the discussion about the sanctions, that North Korea made their quite inflammatory statements saying that they would consider sanctions an act of war.
성 선생 측에서 심사숙고해야 된다.
The remarks came from Park Young-soo, a North Korean negotiator, and were captured on a closed-circuit video.
불바다가 되고 말아요. 아니, 지금 성 선생도 아마 살아나기 어려울 게예요. 다만 그걸
This is pretty strong language, and it got our attention, which I'm sure is what the North Koreans intended that it do.
In South Korea, authorities called for civil defense exercises to prepare the country for an attack. Though aware of the risks, Clinton still decided to push for full sanctions. He also asked the Pentagon to present options for reinforcing U.S. troop strength in South Korea.
And so that led us to that one now somewhat famous meeting of the National Security Council, which the President held in the Cabinet Room, attended by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, a whole lot of people involved, in which the Secretary of Defense presented 3 military options.
I advised President Clinton that we ought to reinforce our military forces. We had gone over the war contingency plans very carefully and concluded that we, in the event of an invasion from the north, we would undoubtedly win, we would be successful in defeating the North. But how many casualties were suffered would depend very much on how well prepared we were. We were literally in the process of giving the briefing to him, laying out the 3 alternative options when the call came in from North Korea.
The phone call comes from Jimmy Carter, who was in Pyongyang at the time, talking to Kim Il-sung, in which Jimmy Carter tells me, I step out of the meeting with the president, to step into a small room to talk to the former president, and Jimmy Carter then describes a possible way out of this situation.
Former President Jimmy Carter had gone on a private trip to Pyongyang to broker a peace deal, even though some senior members of the Clinton White House opposed his effort.
I was given a list of all the U.S. demands concerning nuclear program primarily, but a few others. And when Kim Il-sung agreed with me directly and personally that he would comply with all those demands that I relayed as a messenger, then I was very relieved about that.
There was in the room some unhappiness over the deal, but even
Carter had freelanced.
Well, it wasn't only that Carter had freelanced it, that President Carter also told me that he was about to go on CNN and say what the terms of this would be.
This is CNN Breaking News.
It is now past midnight Friday morning in North Korea, and later today, former President Jimmy Carter plans a second day.
You made a decision to go on CNN while you're sitting there
Yes.
negotiating with Kim Il-sung.
I felt that it was important for the commitments that Kim Il-sung had made to be revealed to the public. It would have made it much more difficult for him to reverse himself or to violate his commitments.
But it wasn't a chess move on your part to try to get this thing aired in order to box in both sides to bring them together?
Well, I can't deny that I hoped that it would consummate a resolution of what I consider to be a very serious crisis.
Kim Il-sung told Carter he would freeze the reactor at Yongbyon and go back to the negotiating table. But a month later, he suddenly died of a heart attack.
어머니 수령님을 존중이 않지 않 연구처가 서서히 어머니 수령님 이게 정말이란 말입니까? 정녕 영결의 시각이 다가왔단 말입니까?
Hundreds of thousands of Koreans came into the streets. The spectacle of people fainting and sobbing lasted days. and gave rise to predictions by U.S. and South Korean intelligence analysts that the North Korean government would now finally fall, and that the best policy was inaction. But they underestimated the great leader's son, Kim Jong-il. He had been ridiculed in the Western press as a playboy who drank expensive Hennessy cognac and cavorted with Swedish blondes. He was insecure about his height, so he wore boots with heels and boofed his hair. He had a voracious interest in movies. He once aspired to be a film producer, and in the 1980s he kidnapped a South Korean film star and her director husband to come show him how. But there is another side to Kim Jong-il. He is linked to acts of terrorism against South Korea. One, a bomb blast in 1983 that killed 4 government cabinet members. Another in 1987 that killed 115 civilians aboard a South Korean airliner. Kim is also tied to North Korea's nuclear program. One of the only public murals in North Korea depicting Kim Jong-il is located at the entrance gate of the Yongbyon nuclear complex. The question now was, would Yongbyan's founder deal away his pet project? On the day of his father's death, negotiations restarted in Geneva between Ambassador Gallucci and Vice Minister Kang. Surprisingly, in October 1994, the two sides agreed. The North Koreans would shut down the Yongbyon complex and cease nuclear plant construction at another location in return for the construction of 2 modern light water reactors, reactors that are harder to use for weapons development. They were also promised 500,000 metric tons of heavy fuel oil annually until the first light water reactor was complete. In Washington, many considered the deal an outrage. James Lilly first heard about the deal when he was visiting with Clinton administration officials.
I think that it was a deal based on extortion. I was in the White House when that deal was announced about the light water reactors, and I said, well, if that's it, that's it. And then they said, we're going to deliver 500,000 tons of oil a year. I almost fell through my chair. I said, you can't make that kind of a commitment. You haven't got the authorization to do this. Under what program are you going to do it? We can handle it. Never mind.
Who says that?
The administration.
Clinton.
Well, it wasn't Clinton. Tony Lake was there. Christopher was there. Gore was there. All of them were there. And I forget which person said it, but he said, don't worry about it. We can handle this. We can reprogram money around. We get this money.
What did you say?
I said, good luck. I said, I don't think this makes any sense.
Anybody listen to you?
No.
Under the agreed framework, they will accept those inspections. They don't accept them.
The agreed framework was defended before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by Robert Gallucci and William Perry.
This is the agreement which both sides would agree to. I could get a better agreement if I could sit on both sides of the table, but I'm only allowed to sit on one side of the table. And there's another country with other interests sitting on the other side of the table.
The framework was hammered. Within 10 days after the framework was signed, it became a political orphan. The Democrats, President Clinton, lost control of both houses of Congress, and conservative Republicans, particularly in the House, who hated the agreed framework, believed that it was basically an example of the U.S. paying extortion, began to oppose it very fiercely.
Yeah, we did not get ticker tape parades, as it turned out.
What happened? What did you hear?
That we had submitted to blackmail. The North Koreans were threatening us with a nuclear program, and we gave in and gave them good things.
I spoke out against it. I debated Mr. Gallucci. I did everything in my power because I thought it was a terribly flawed agreement that would result in us being where we are today, with a huge, enormous threat to the United States of America.
You called Clinton an appeaser.
Well, you know, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's appeasement.
So what was the alternative?
The alternative was to say, you stop this development of nuclear weapons, or we exercise every option we have, not excluding the military option. Sanctions, conversations with the Japanese, the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Russians, exercise every option. Don't engage in bribery, which is what it was. It was bribery.
But in retrospect, they would have 50, 60 bombs by now. And
in retrospect, if they hadn't stopped doing it, we would have acted militarily, and we wouldn't be facing the magnitude of the threat that we're facing now.
You had tremendous resistance to this. McCain calls it appeasement. What was the consequence of that?
General dissatisfaction with the whole agreed framework made every appropriation just one of the rings of hell.
And you would have to go
on hands and knees
to Congress.
Yes.
Asking for the money.
Repeatedly.
While Congress dragged its feet, a Korean-speaking State Department official, Ken Quinones, was dispatched to Yongbyon. He was there along with inspectors from the IAEA to verify that the reactor was shut down and that the North Koreans properly handled and stored their plutonium-laden spent fuel rods.
What was that like, being around that spent fuel?
It was an intense experience. It tested you physically. It was bitter cold. Food rations were sometimes very short supply. And of course, we worked in a highly radioactive environment.
A lot of tension?
Tensions would flare over somebody looking strange at another person, or making the international hand gesture.
The international hand gesture?
Yeah, the finger.
But you succeeded?
Yeah, ultimately we did.
Stored all the 8,000 fuel rods?
They all got stored. North Korea did in fact comply with all the stipulations of the agreed framework, as stated in the annual reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency.
What was the United States record on compliance?
U.S. record was quite spotty, frankly speaking.
In my judgment, the administration was not prepared to expend very much political capital on behalf of implementation of the agreed framework.
State Department official Stephen Bosworth was head of CATO, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, an entity created by the agreed framework to build the two promised light water reactors. In part because of congressional opposition, construction fell behind and delivery of the heavy fuel oil was often late. The North Koreans complained frequently. Bosworth complained to his colleagues in the State Department.
So tell me what arguments you made.
That, first of all, this was an attempt to draw North Korea out of its dark cave out into the world, and that it was in our interest to break down that isolation in which North Korea existed. Moreover, that it was very much in our interest, since this was North Korea's first agreement, in effect, with the outside world, to make sure that we complied with the agreement in a meticulous fashion, to demonstrate to the North Koreans that they could enter into agreements with us and others and be confident that the commitments that we made in those agreements would be implemented. Failure to basically deal with the North Koreans would cause them to do increasingly irresponsible and dangerous things.
While tensions over compliance with the agreed framework mounted between the U.S. and North Korea, a new president, Kim Dae-jung, came to office in South Korea. He instituted a new approach to dealing with North Korea called the Sunshine Policy, advocating openness and engagement. It assumed that Kim Jong-il wanted to modernize his economy. President Kim's right-hand man was Lim Dong-won.
I was an architect of Sunshine Policy and evangelist of Sunshine Policy. So we want to induce change in the North. That is the way to build confidence between the South and North, and to make peace on the Korean Peninsula. So we have to seize this moment.
Lim, a former chief of South Korean intelligence and staunch anti-communist, would make many trips to meet with Kim Jong-il.
And what kind of man was he?
He has a sense of humor. He's, very interesting. He has a very interesting personality. He's a wine drinker.
Cognac, I hear.
No, he quit cognac. That's what he told me.
He told you that he quit drinking cognac?
Yeah. Now just prefer to drink wines only for his health. That's what he said.
Did you talk to him about the dire situation in the countryside, the starvation, the fact that he spends also so much money on the military? And...
Well, I didn't touch much of that kind of things. Yes.
Just as diplomacy seemed it had a fighting chance, however, North Korea played another surprise card. On August 31st, 1998, the North Koreans launched the Taepodong missile, a design that, if successful, could reach Hawaii or Alaska. A missile developed by a country that already derived 25% of its export income from sales of Scuds and other short-range missiles into the Middle East, Pakistan, and Iran.
The North Koreans fired this ballistic missile, and everybody in the region and the United States woke up and said, boy, we haven't been paying attention to them, but they've sure been paying attention.
The missile launch was an embarrassment for Clinton, who had backed South Korea's Sunshine Policy. Mandated by Congress to review U.S. policy towards North Korea, the president called once again on William Perry.
The agreed framework was on the block. We looked seriously at the approaches many in the U.S., many in Congress had asked us to consider, one of which was that we should simply put pressure on the North Koreans until their government collapsed. We rejected that alternative. They have an iron police state in North Korea, and the misery of the people, in our judgment, was not likely to lead to a popular overthrow of the government. Secondly, we didn't have enough time. Even if that strategy was successful, the most optimistic view of it would take several years. So it was a very difficult problem.
Upon Perry's recommendation, the Clinton administration stuck with diplomacy. In 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright flew to Pyongyang to negotiate a missile deal. Her CIA briefing had not prepared her for the man she was about to meet.
We had very peculiar information about Kim Jong-il, that he was a recluse. I think delusional actually was a word that was used, but Kim Dae-jung had reported that it was possible to have perfectly decent, rational conversations with him.
I think that Secretary Albright and I were surprised about Kim. He had some humor. He actually, and very unsurprisingly, had tremendous pride in himself, in his country.
He's a reasonable man who was fully engaged with us for that very extensive period that Secretary Albright was with him. He always seemed to be personally attentive to the people that he was hosting.
Gracious, in other words.
I hate to use the word lest I be criticized later, but yes, I would say he was gracious.
At the end of about 3 or 4 hours of official meetings, he said, I want to take you tonight to a huge celebration. What we were going to was the recreation of the 50th anniversary celebration of the Workers' Party.
We proceeded to climb into this long motorcade that his limousine headed, and we went off to this stadium. Now, we pulled up to the stadium, and it was pitch dark, no cars in the lot, no people walking around, no sound. You could have heard a pin drop. So we walked into the stadium, and then all of a sudden, the lights all flashed on, and this wall of sound from 250,000 North Koreans hit us all at once.
We walked in, and we were in a stadium where there was something like 200 to 250,000 people who applauded wildly.
Everybody was on their feet with their hands in the air, and they were all screaming and shouting their hosannas to Kim Jong-il. And this hit us, and it made me feel pretty grand, I can tell you.
That has to do something to someone's psyche when you're cheered on like that. It was as Stalinist a country as ever has been.
I have to say I was fascinated. You know how they do those flashcards at our big football games where students can deliver various messages? Well, this was done in the most precise way, where they showed tableaus of various scenes of countrysides, and then there was one, and they were so good at it that they could make a rocket go up by moving the cards, and it was a Taepodong missile.
The next day, Secretary Albright and Chairman Kim sat down again and talked about missiles. Kim Jong-il also reiterated an invitation to President Clinton to come to North Korea.
The purpose, I think, generally of his policy was to get some recognition from the United States that North Korea existed, that we should have diplomatic relations. And so he was really quite open in discussions that we had in terms of limiting his missile program. We must be pragmatic and recognize that the road to fully normal relations remains uphill.
We had the deal almost in hand. The detail or two that needed to be worked out were very, very important details to do with how all this would be verified. But those were not the issues that curtailed the visit so much as we just ran out of time.
With the coming of President George W. Bush, both North and South Korea asked for reassurance that the missile talks initiated by the Clinton administration would continue. It appeared the transition would be smooth.
We do plan to engage with North Korea to pick up where President Clinton and his administration left off. Some promising elements were left on the table.
The South Koreans pushed for an early summit meeting.
My foreign minister went to Washington to prepare for this summit meeting. And during that consultation with the Department of State and Secretary Powell, they assured us that new administration's North Korea policy will be, continuing where the Clinton administration took off.
He assured you that the policies of the Clinton administration would continue into the Bush administration.
Yes, yeah. So we are very happy to hear that. And then President Kim came to Washington, D.C.
Watch out. But the summit was not what the South Koreans expected. Although Bush publicly endorsed South Korea's Sunshine Policy,
it's been my honor to welcome President Kim here in the Oval Office. We had a very good discussion.
Privately, he told Kim talks with the North were off, and the U.S. did not support a policy of engagement. Kim Dae-jung was stunned.
It was a really unfortunate thing.
Was he angry? He was furious.
Maybe so.
He talked to you when he returned to Seoul.
He was, of course, disappointed at that time, yes. And returning from Washington, D.C., North Korea immediately announced that no dialogue with South Korean government.
So everything fell apart?
Yeah, everything fell apart.
President Bush said, I don't trust Kim Jong-il. We're going to have a policy review, and we're not going to do anything until we've finished the policy review. So there was just really a cutoff of the progress that had been made.
So what happened to U.S. policy towards North Korea when the new administration?
It's never had a policy. It's had an attitude.
What's the attitude?
Hostility.
I think the break in continuity had to do with the belief that the policy had been wrong, that when you pay blackmail, you're asking for further blackmail.
A longtime advisor to the Pentagon, Richard Pearl, is among those conservatives critical of Clinton, Perry, and Albright's approach to North Korea.
I think what they would say is that talk should not have been cut off, that open dialogue should have continued.
That there should have been more blackmail. They wouldn't characterize it in that way, of course, but that is, in fact, what it was and what it remains.
This was a policy that was advocated by the South Koreans under Kim Dae-jung. Kim Dae-jung came to Washington, for instance, early on in his administration and felt rebuffed.
I think Kim Dae-jung's interests and the interests of the South Koreans are not at all identical to ours. And it's understandable. Seoul is within artillery range of thousands of North Korean artillery tubes. So it's hardly surprising that the South Koreans are going to see this differently from the way we see it. But our president has, first and foremost, a commitment to the security of the United States.
In North Korea, Kim Jong-il was also confronting Bush's new policy. The Clinton administration had been willing to talk before Kim made concessions or complied with existing agreements. The Bush administration was demanding concessions and full compliance before talks could begin. They also expanded the agenda. The North Koreans accused Bush of moving the goalposts.
I would hope that we would move the goalposts because we didn't like the playing field that was established during the Clinton administration. It was a playing field on which we were expected to pay the North Koreans not to do dangerous things. And that is not a sound basis for a policy.
When President Bush came before Congress in January of 2002,
the President of the United States.
Talks with North Korea were still on hold. And now the terrorist attacks of 9/11 were raising new fears about weapons proliferation, the possibility that a rogue nation could sell its missiles and nuclear technology to a terrorist group. In his speech that night, Bush put a few countries on notice.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror.
Then, the president used a phrase for which he will long be remembered.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
North Korea said the speech was part of an aggressive and hostile policy.
These regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
North Koreans complaining about words. Have you ever read the press statements, the governmental statements that they put out about the United States?
When Frontline approached the White House for an interview on North Korean policy, they referred us to the State Department, which designated U.S. Ambassador to South Korea Thomas Hubbard as their spokesman.
It's kind of hard. I have trouble understanding.
But we shouldn't let them set the moral standard.
Of course not. Of course not. I think there's been entirely too much focus on words and too little focus on the substance of the policy.
Words matter. You're a diplomat. The concern is that the policy has been, in a way, stagnant, that in the words of a former ambassador, there is no policy at this point. There's simply an attitude.
I think that's an exaggeration. The clear policy of our government is that we find nuclear weapons in North Korea to be unacceptable and intolerable.
What the president did in referring to the axis of evil was identify evil where it exists, and to make it very clear that we were going to treat evil regimes with a full recognition of what they represent. If the word evil doesn't apply to North Korea, it doesn't apply to any nation.
I don't think the argument is that evil doesn't apply to Kim Jong-il. I think the argument is that it does not have any real benefits. It's not as if we didn't already know that this place was nasty and dangerous. So what does the president gain?
I think he breaks with the previous policy that said, well, they may be evil, but we're going to treat them as if they could be counted upon to respect an agreement. In short, we will deal with them in a way that we would not deal with a nation whose fundamental evil quality was properly understood.
Were you surprised by the administration's language and approach?
I was surprised. I thought, I'm not surprised that some people in the administration thought that. I was surprised that they would take that policy approach to North Korea. I thought it was counterproductive.
Why? Why not show that you're tough, that you're not going to be the appeasers that the Clinton administration was?
Yes, I've heard that language. Talking tough and acting tough and putting pressure on North Korea is not an effective policy. It may be therapeutic for us to talk that way, but it does not accomplish our objectives and does not enhance our security.
Sometime in the summer of 2002, the CIA, working with evidence that it had been collecting since the middle of Clinton's second term, concluded that North Korea was secretly pursuing an alternative nuclear weapons program.
Now, somewhere along the way, U.S. intelligence starts to report that they're on shopping trips, that they're in Pakistan buying high-frequency modulators, aluminum tubes.
Apparently, we got definitive aerial photographs of equipment from Pakistan being delivered. It became a matter of certitude in July or August.
They were buying equipment to build a uranium enrichment plant. Uranium enrichment takes place in centrifuge tubes like these, but it takes 2 to 3 years to make enough weapons-grade uranium for a bomb. But like the separate program at Yongbyon, it showed Kim's intent to go nuclear. On October 3, 2002, James Kelly, an Assistant Secretary of State, traveled to Pyongyang to confront officials.
As Kelly geared up for his trip, apparently there was a dogfight within the administration. Should he mention it? Should he not mention it? And those who said he should mention it put it right at the top of the agenda. So that really was the only thing that was discussed at his 3rd October meeting. And then, interestingly enough, the North Koreans, after caucusing overnight, came back and said, yes, we do have that program.
Now, Kim's nuclear card was on the table face up. A few weeks later, Bush played his hand. He ordered the agreed framework dead and cut off all future fuel oil shipments. North Korea retaliated by turning off all monitoring equipment at Yongbyon and sending inspectors home. In January 2003, the North Koreans gave notice that they were withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The U.S. and North Korea are back at the brink. The U.S. has refused to talk unless Japan, South Korea, and China are involved. The Sunshine Policy is also in trouble. Lim Dong-won and President Kim Dae-jung are being investigated for funneling as much as $500 million to Kim Jong-il's Singapore bank account in 1998 to buy his cooperation. North Korea, meanwhile, still insists on direct talks with the U.S.
So why not talk to them? These regional powers are saying, go talk to the North Koreans.
Well, do we have to give them what they want all the time? I think that's one of our concerns, that it might be tactically attractive for the North Koreans to try to isolate us and put pressure on us in a bilateral negotiation, but that's not necessarily in the interest of the United States. We think a multilateral approach would be much better.
This meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is called to order.
Inside the administration, debate continues over how to structure talks with North Korea. In February 2003, Colin Powell's deputy, Richard Armitage, a Northeast Asia specialist, was called to Capitol Hill.
In my discussions with the Japanese and the South Koreans, they're saying multilateral is good, count us in, but don't wait. We recommend you do it bilaterally. Now, am I wrong? Are they not recommending that?
No, they are indeed suggesting that. And our suggestion is not quite that we handle these talks multilaterally, but we have a multilateral umbrella of any sort.
Armitage's performance reportedly infuriated President Bush. The next day, he called a special White House meeting and ordered a ban on any public discussion of anything that might resemble one-on-one or bilateral talks with North Korea.
There is no way but to have direct talks between North Korea and the U.S. Otherwise, war.
Bilateral talks?
Yes, bilateral talks.
The Bush administration says they won't do it.
Yeah, of course, they said that.
The Bush administration is saying we shouldn't have to give them anything. They're violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're in defiance of the world. They should be held to task. That appeasement leads to more aggressive behavior.
Well, it depends on if you decide that direct talks are appeasement. This administration has kind of dug its heels in and said anything that we do vis-a-vis North Korea is appeasement. Once you define it that way, it's very hard to unpaint yourself. And I think that's where we are now. I hope very much that there can be some way to get off of this escalation.
But the escalation continues. Kim Jong-il has stepped up air raid drills in Pyongyang. In March 2003, North Korea started up their reactor at Yongbyon. They tested 2 short-range missiles. They intercepted and harassed a U.S. spy plane flying off their coast. They announced they were pulling out of armistice talks that had been going on for 50 years. The Bush administration, busy with a war in Iraq, insists it has no intention to invade North Korea, and that the situation does not rise to the level of a crisis.
If we're willing to go to war in Iraq, why aren't we willing to go to war in North Korea?
These issues have been well answered by a whole variety of people, but we continue to believe that you can't just follow a cookie cutter approach. That we continue to believe that the North Korean problem is one that can be resolved through diplomacy.
What prevents them from going nuclear?
If they're determined to go nuclear, they're going to go nuclear, and then we have to deal with that problem.
Why isn't this a crisis?
Because we believe that this is a problem that can be solved. We don't have a precise formula for that yet, but we do believe it is still possible.
They say there's no crisis.
I have to be very clear on that point. I think what North Korea is doing now with the nuclear weapon program is not only a crisis, it is a serious crisis. We have, I think, months, not years, to resolve this problem before it reaches a point of no return in terms of North Korea becoming a major nuclear power.
This report continues on Frontline's website with analyses by key insiders on whether there's still time to avert a military or nuclear showdown.
Headed more on a road to war.
A chronology of the threats, deceptions, and diplomatic ploys that have marked U.S.-North Korea relations. A closer look at who are the North Koreans and what is their nuclear capability. Plus, a web-exclusive interview with the North Korean defector. You can watch the program again online. Then join the discussion at PBS Online, pbs.org.
Next time on Frontline.
There is a cyber jihad going on right now.
Without a single bomb.
The right people could take out huge sections of American infrastructure.
Terrorists could use the internet to cripple the United States.
We have created a new nervous system for the country, and we've done nothing to protect it.
How real is the threat?
America is at risk.
Cyber war. Watch Frontline.
To order Kim's nuclear gamble on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.